Jason Callahan. In the summer of 1995, a Volkswagen van crashed into two trees on a quiet stretch of highway in Southern Virginia. The driver was identified within hours. He was a college student from South Carolina. The young man in the passenger seat had no wallet, no identification, and a face too damaged for any photograph. Investigators found a few small things in his pockets, including two scalped Grateful Dead concert ticket stubs and a handwritten note from someone named Caroline. He was buried in a pauper's grave under the name Grateful Doe. He would stay nameless for 20 years. The breakthrough would come from a Reddit page, an Imgur post, and a single direct message sent by a former roommate from Illinois. On the afternoon of June 26, 1995, around 1:30 in the afternoon, a Volkswagen Vanagon ran off US Route 58 West near Emporia in Greensville County, Virginia, and struck two trees. Both occupants were killed. Neither had been wearing a seatbelt. The driver was quickly identified as 21-year-old University of South Carolina student Michael Eric Hager. His passenger had no identification on him at all. The young man's facial injuries made photographic identification impossible, so authorities relied on artists' reconstructions. In his pockets, investigators found 4 quarters, a yellow bike lighter, 2 scalped Grateful Dead ticket stubs from June 24th and 25th, 1995, at RFK Stadium in Washington, D.C., and a handwritten note signed by Caroline T. and Caroline O., addressed to a person named Jason. He wore a red tie-dye Grateful Dead t-shirt, Levi's jeans, white socks, and black Fila running shoes. He had a small handmade-looking pentagram tattoo on his upper left arm and reddish-brown dyed hair. He came to be called Grateful Doe. How does a young man in his early 20s die in a highway crash in plain view of investigators and stay nameless for 20 years? The answer was a strange one. Fingerprints returned no hits. Dental records, taken from teeth that were well cared for and showed no work, produced no match. Crucially, no missing persons report was ever filed for him. His mother, Margaretta Evans of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, did not know where her son had gone. He had been on the road following the Grateful Dead. He moved often. She had no idea which jurisdiction to call. Without a missing persons file to compare against, Grateful Doe was a closed loop in every law enforcement database. His remains were buried in a pauper's grave in Greensville County, Virginia, listed in NAMUS as Case Up 6095. Cold case forums kicked the file around for nearly a decade. The decisive turn came in December 2014. A Redditor using the handle Grey Metal posted Grateful Doe's facial reconstructions to Imgur and helped seed a dedicated subreddit called r/Grateful Doe. The subreddit was co-founded and moderated by Layla Betts, a young woman in Queensland, Australia. At one point, she spent up to 12 hours a day moderating the community. The reconstructions were shared widely on Reddit and on a related Facebook page. They were reportedly seen by more than 500,000 people. In early January 2015, a man going only by the name Steve sent a Reddit private message saying he believed the reconstruction looked like a former roommate from Illinois named Jason. The two had lived together in late 1994 and early 1995. Steve sent photos. The photos were posted to the Grateful Doe Facebook page. Within days, the post was seen by Margaretta Evans's other son, and then by Evans herself. She recognized her son in the photos. On January 12th and 13th, 2015, she filed a missing persons report with the Myrtle Beach Police Department. It was the first missing persons report ever filed for him. DNA was then collected from Callahan's half-sister, Shannon Michelson, processed by the University of North Texas Health Science Center Forensic Lab, and coordinated through NAMUS. On December 9th, 2015, The Virginia office of the Chief Medical Examiner and NamUs confirmed that Grateful Doe was Jason Patrick Callahan, born April 18, 1976, 19 years old at the time of his death. Shannon told the Associated Press, "Had I not found the post and Reddit pages in January, I would have never known that my brother Jason was still missing, or what happened to him." Layla Betts later said, "It wasn't that this case had been solved after 20 years. It was that Jason Callahan was finally going to go home. The crash itself is now closed as a traffic fatality. There is no outstanding criminal investigation. The crash is presumed to have been caused by Hager falling asleep at the wheel." Jason's remains were repatriated to South Carolina and reburied at home. The mystery of who Caroline T. and Caroline O. were, the writers of the handwritten note found in Jason's pocket on the day he died, has never been resolved. The r/Grateful Doe subreddit remains active today as a hub for other unidentified decedent cases. The next case takes us to 1974 Ohio, where a teenager went to a Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young concert with her boyfriend, returned home before dawn, and would not be identified for 43 years. Linda Pagano. In the summer of 1974, a 17-year-old high school student in Akron, Ohio, went to a concert with her boyfriend. She came home late. She argued with her stepfather. He told her to leave. She walked out of the apartment. She was never seen alive again. Months later, 3 teenage boys hiking along a river in a nearby Cleveland area park would find partial skeletal remains in the sand. The bones were buried in an unmarked grave. They would stay nameless for 43 years. The break in the case would come from a Cleveland State University student looking through cemetery records on Reddit. Linda Marie Pagano was a 17-year-old Springfield High School student in Akron, Ohio. She was born April 11, 1957. On the night of August 31, 1974, she attended a Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young concert in Cleveland with her boyfriend Steve Wilson. In the early hours of September 1, 1974, she returned to the Carnegie Avenue apartment of her stepfather, Byron Claflin, a bartender her relatives later described as having a volatile temper. According to Claflin, who was the only witness, the two argued about her late return. He told her to leave. She walked out of the apartment. She was never seen alive again. Her car, a Ford Mustang, was left behind. How does a teenager who walked out of a known address on a known date with a known stepfather as the last person to see her stay missing and unidentified for more than 4 decades? On February 5, 1975, 3 teenage boys hiking on a sandbar of the Rocky River in the Mill Stream Run Reservation in Strongsville, Ohio, found partial skeletal remains about 800 feet west of Eastland Road. The remains were incomplete. The skull bore a single gunshot wound. The case was classified as homicide. Investigators initially even tried to match the bones to missing heiress Patty Hearst. The clerical failures that kept Linda's case hidden are some of the most painful in modern American cold case work. Linda's missing persons file lived with the Akron Police Department in Summit County. The unidentified Strongsville Jane Doe homicide investigation lived with Cleveland Metro Parks Rangers in adjacent Cuyahoga County. The unidentified bones were buried in an unmarked grave in Potter's Field at Highland Park Cemetery. And because of a clerical error, they were never entered into any unidentified decedent database. Linda's brother, Michael Pagano, even saw a 1975 television broadcast about the Strongsville Jane Doe and called police, but he was told the remains were too tall and too old to be his sister. Their mother, Anne Marie Pagano, died in 2012 without ever knowing what had happened to her daughter. In 2016, a Cleveland State University student named Christina Skates, who used the Reddit handle CallMe's, was sifting through Cuyahoga County cemetery records as part of her own family genealogy research. She noticed a listing for unknown white female bones with a gunshot wound to the head, recovered in Strongsville, February 5, 1975. The remains had been interred in Potter's Field. There was no follow-up. She obtained the autopsy report and a photo of the skull. She posted her findings on Reddit and contacted the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's office. Within days, the case was finally entered into NAMUS. Her post caught the eye of Carl Koppelman, a longtime volunteer forensic artist active in Doe communities. Koppelman used the skull photo to create a new facial reconstruction. Months later, Koppelman noticed that the new reconstruction looked nearly identical to a photo of Linda Pagano newly posted on NAMUS. The age, the skeletal stature, and the time of disappearance all aligned. The mouth is practically identical, Michael Pagano later said. Akron Police Sergeant Jeff Smith and Lieutenant Rick Edwards contacted the Pagano family in April 2017. Dental records were exchanged in December 2016. In October 2017, the remains were exhumed from Potter's Field with assistance from the University of Akron. DNA from bone samples was matched to mouth swabs from siblings Michael and Cheryl Pagano. On July 12, 2018, the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office, the Akron Police Department, and the Cleveland Metro Parks Rangers jointly announced the identification. Michael Pagano said, "I thought this day would never come. I thought I would die wondering." Linda's homicide remains an open, active investigation. 2 persons of interest have been named, including stepfather Byron Claflin, who died in 1990, and her former boyfriend, Steve Wilson. No arrest has ever been made, and no suspect has ever been formally charged. A funeral service was held in 2018, more than 4 decades after she had walked out of her stepfather's apartment. She was reburied at Holy Cross Cemetery in Akron, in a marked grave with her name finally on it. The next case takes us to a small motel on the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State, where a young man checked in under a name borrowed from a novel and left behind $160 in $20 bills with a note that read, "For the room." Lyle Stevick. In September 2001, just 6 days after the September 11th attacks, staff at a small motel on the remote Olympic Peninsula of Washington State found a young man hanged inside a closet of his room. He had checked in 2 days earlier under the name Lyle Stevick. His listed home address was a Best Western in Idaho, where staff did not recognize him. He had no luggage. He had no identification. He had no wallet. He had left $160 in $20 bills on the nightstand with a handwritten note. The death was quickly ruled suicide. The mystery of who he actually was would last nearly 17 years. The break in the case would come from a Reddit fundraiser that closed in less than 24 hours. On September 17, 2001, staff at the Lake Quinault Inn Motel in Amanda Park, Washington, found the young man inside a closet of his room. He had checked in 2 days earlier under the name Lyle Stevick. The death was quickly ruled suicide. The estimated date was September 16th. What turned the case into one of the internet's most discussed mysteries was the elaborate care he had taken to remain anonymous. He carried no luggage, no identification, and no wallet. He had only a toothbrush and toothpaste. He had closed the room's blinds. He had lined the closet with pillows to muffle sound. He had left $160 in $20 bills on the nightstand with a note reading, "For the room." A separate scrap of paper in the trash had the word "suicide" written on it, as if he had been practicing the spelling. The pseudonym he used appeared to be drawn from the character Lyle Stevick, with a slightly different spelling, in Joyce Carol Oates' 1987 novel, You Must Remember This, in which Stevick contemplates suicide. How does a young man take such elaborate care to erase his own identity in a small, remote town in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 and stay unknown for nearly 2 decades? He was described as 5 feet 11 inches tall, roughly 25 years old, fair-skinned with black hair and green or hazel eyes, with an appendectomy scar, evidence of past orthodontic work, and a small mole on the left side of his chin. The autopsy showed he had recently lost up to 40 pounds. His jeans were oversized. Because the body was fresh, examiners obtained perfect fingerprints, a full dental chart, and DNA. None matched anything in CODIS or any international database. A 2007 spotlight via a forensic awareness initiative produced no leads. 2 missing men, Alexander Craig and Stephen Needham, were considered and ruled out. He was buried in an unmarked grave in Fern Hill Cemetery, Aberdeen, Washington, and the file aged for 16 years. Lyle Stevick became a fixture on ER/Unresolved, Mysteries, Web Sleuths, and the Doe Network for over a decade. The combination of the literary alias, the planned anonymity, and the post-9/11 timing made him one of the most heavily theorized John Does on the internet. A dedicated subreddit kept the case in active conversation. The DNA Doe Project, founded by Margaret Press and Colleen Fitzpatrick, would later confirm that the case had been brought to them by a Reddit user. As Margaret Press wrote, the project was originally approached by a Reddit user, and when it became clear that followers on the Lyle Stevick Reddit group would fully fund the case, they contacted the Grays Harbor coroner about taking it on. This was the first crowd-funded forensic genetic genealogy campaign the DNA Doe Project ever ran. It was fully funded within 24 hours. It is the moment the modern crowd-funded cold case era began. In January 2018, samples were sent to a private genetics lab for sequencing. On March 22, 2018, the genetic profile was uploaded to the GED Match genealogy database. About 20 DNA Doe Project volunteers worked the family tree. They traced clusters of relatives in northern New Mexico and Idaho, then to a candidate family in California. DNA indicated he was at least 1/4 Native American and 1/4 Hispanic. Investigators with the Grays Harbor County Sheriff's Office contacted the family. The family confirmed his identity through childhood fingerprints. The family had assumed he was alive and had simply chosen to cut contact with them years earlier. On May 8, 2018, the Grays Harbor County Sheriff's Office formally announced the identification. At the family's request, his real name has never been publicly released. The deeper questions, including why he traveled to the remote Olympic Peninsula, why he chose the Joyce Carol Oates alias, and what precipitated the rapid weight loss, remain unanswered. The family's request for permanent privacy has been respected. Lyle Stevick's case is now considered the proof of concept that established crowd-funded forensic genetic genealogy as a viable model for identifying nameless remains worldwide. The next case takes us back to a roadside ditch in rural Ohio in the spring of 1981, where a young woman in a handmade fringed buckskin poncho would lie unidentified for 37 years. Marcia King. On the morning of April 24, 1981, the body of a young woman was discovered in a ditch alongside a country road just outside Troy, Ohio. She was fully clothed in what would become her unforgettable trademark, a handmade fringed buckskin poncho with a purple satin lining. She had no shoes. She had no jewelry. She had no identification. She would be known for the next 37 years simply as Buckskin Girl. The case would become one of the most discussed Jane Doe files on the entire English-speaking internet. The breakthrough would come in under 4 hours of active genealogical research after the case became one of the very first ever taken on by the new DNA Doe Project. The body was found in a ditch alongside Greenlee Road, west of Troy, Ohio, in Miami County. She had been deceased approximately 24 to 48 hours. The cause of death was strangulation and blunt force trauma to the head. She was fully clothed in a brown and orange turtleneck sweater, Wrangler bell-bottom jeans, and a handmade fringed buckskin poncho with a purple satin lining. She wore no shoes, no socks, and no jewelry. She carried no identification. She was 5 feet 6 inches tall, about 130 pounds, with reddish-brown hair tied in braids, with 2 blue rubber bands, light brown eyes, and freckles. The clean soles of her feet indicated she had been killed elsewhere and dumped. The scene was 5 miles from Interstate 75. How does a young woman in a one-of-a-kind handmade poncho, with carefully kept teeth and a distinctive face, lie nameless on a roadside in Ohio for nearly 4 decades? The Miami County Sheriff's Office ran her DNA profile through CODIS in 2001 and again in 2009. Both runs returned no match. She appeared briefly on Unsolved Mysteries in 1992 in connection with a theory about a serial offender then operating in Ohio. But the connection was eventually disproven. There was no sign of sexual harm. Her teeth had been well cared for. Forensic pollen analysis was conducted on her clothing in 2016 by U.S. Customs and Border Protection. The pollen suggested time spent in the northeastern U.S., the arid western United States, and the Pittsburgh and Louisville areas. She was one of the first Jane Does entered into NIMS in 2009. NCMEC released new facial renderings in 2016. None of it produced an identification. No missing persons report had ever been filed for her. Buckskin Girl was for decades one of the most discussed cases on r/unresolved mysteries, on web sleuths, and on the Doe Network. Theories tied her to the Ohio Bible Belt Strangler and to the Redhead murders. The relentless online attention is what kept her file from being shelved entirely. It was a primary driver of the DNA Doe Project's decision to take her on in 2017 as one of its first cases. A vial of her blood, preserved since 1981, was sent to a private lab to develop a high-density DNA profile. DNA Doe Project volunteers uploaded the profile to GED Match. The result came faster than anyone expected. In what co-founder Colleen Fitzpatrick called an unusually fast result, under 4 hours of active research, volunteers found a first cousin once-removed match. That family tree included a relative who had been known to be missing and presumed deceased. Her name was Marcia Lenore Sossaman King. She had been born June 9, 1959, in Little Rock, Arkansas. She had been 21 years old at the time of her death. The match was confirmed by the Miami Valley Regional Crime Lab in Dayton on April 9, 2018. It was announced publicly by Sheriff Dave Duchak and Chief Deputy Steve Lord on April 11, 2018. Marcia had been known to hitchhike. She had last been seen by family in Little Rock in 1980. No missing persons report had ever been filed because she was an adult who had drifted out of contact. Her mother had lived in the same Arkansas house and kept the same phone number for 37 years, hoping Marcia would call home. Her stepfather, John Sossaman, had passed away only 3 months before the identification was made. Sheriff Lord said, "They were hopeful Marcia was going to come home. However, they're learning at this date that that's not going to happen." Her homicide remains unsolved. Investigators have since pieced together that she had been in Pittsburgh and Louisville, Kentucky in March 1981, about 2 weeks before her death. A new headstone bearing Marcia's name now stands at Riverside Cemetery in Troy, Ohio. The hairs found at the original crime scene in 1981 are still preserved. Investigators have stated they hope to one day extract DNA from those hairs and identify the person who killed her. The next case takes us to 1997 Florida, where a man left a Lantana nightclub at 11 in the evening, called his girlfriend to say he was on his way home, and would not be seen again until a stranger casually browsed Google Earth 22 years later. William Mould. On the night of November 7, 1997, a 40-year-old mortgage broker in Lantana, Florida, was at a local nightclub. Around 9:30 in the evening, he called his girlfriend to say he would be home soon. Around 11, witnesses saw him leave the club alone, apparently sober, and get into his white Saturn. He never made it home. There was no body. There was no car. There was no foul play. There was no financial activity. There was nothing for 22 years. Then a former neighbor, casually scrolling Google Earth, noticed a strange white shape at the bottom of a retention pond in a quiet Florida subdivision. He had been visible from satellite for 12 years before anyone looked. William Earl Moult was a 40-year-old mortgage broker living in Lantana, Florida. On the evening of November 7, 1997, he was at a nightclub in Lantana. Around 9:30 in the evening, he called his girlfriend to say he would be home soon. Witnesses saw him leave the club alone around 11 that night, apparently sober. He got into his white 1994 Saturn SL. He was never seen alive again. He was reported missing on November 8th. How does a sober adult driving a familiar route home vanish completely with no body, no car, no financial activity, and no foul play in the middle of suburban Florida? There was no sign of foul play, no charges to bank accounts, no body, and no vehicle. A retention pond in the under-construction Grand Isles development in Wellington, Florida, about 15 miles from the club, sat right by the route home. But the entire community had been a construction zone in 1997, and the pond was apparently never searched at the time. What no one realized for years was that the answer was visible from space. The submerged car had been visible on Google Earth satellite imagery since 2007. For 12 years, anyone in the world with an internet connection could have seen it. No one looked. Moult's disappearance had been a perennial discussion case on r/unresolved mysteries, with one popular post recapping the case drawing 51,000 upvotes and over 1,000 comments. His Charlie Project profile had been widely circulated on Reddit and on missing persons blogs for 2 decades. The case became part of the broad, shared online culture of casual satellite browsing and crowdsourced investigation that the unresolved mysteries community had quietly built up over the previous decade. In August 2019, a former resident of the Grand Isles neighborhood was looking at his old block on Google Earth. He noticed a white shape in a retention pond on Moonbase Circle. He took screenshots. He sent them to his ex-wife. She recognized her current neighbor's house and the pond behind it. The neighbor, a man named Barry Fay, had moved to Wellington only 14 months earlier. He used a drone to confirm that the white shape was indeed a submerged car. He called the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office on August 28, 2019. Deputies pulled the heavily calcified car from the pond that night. Skeletal remains were inside. On September 10, 2019, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office and the Medical Examiner's Office positively identified the remains as William Moult. The car was confirmed as Moult's missing 1994 Saturn. The case was closed as a presumed single-vehicle accident. Investigators believe Moult lost control of the vehicle and drove into the unfenced retention pond, possibly while the area was an active construction zone. There was no suspect. There was no foul play. There were no charges. A spokesperson for the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office told the BBC, "You can't determine what happened that many years ago, what transpired. All we know is that he went missing off the face of the earth." and now he's been discovered. Molt's family received closure after 22 years. The case is the closest analog any modern cold case has to civic open-source investigation. It was not solved by an organized search. It was solved by exactly the kind of casual, distracted satellite-scrolling habit that the online sleuth community had quietly trained an entire generation of internet users to exhibit. 12 years of imagery sat publicly visible on the internet. All it took was one person to look in the right place at the right moment. The pond he was found in had not been searched in 1997 because the entire neighborhood was a construction site at the time. By the time the Grand Isles development was finished, no one had connected the missing man case from the previous fall to the small body of water now sitting beside someone's backyard. The next case takes us to a Virginia cemetery in December 1996, where a groundskeeper would discover an elderly woman in the section reserved for infants, accompanied by a small decorated Christmas tree, a Walkman playing a Mel Brooks comedy tape, and a stack of carefully written suicide notes, signed only Jane Doe. The Annandale Jane Doe. On the morning of December 18, 1996, a groundskeeper at a small memorial park in Annandale, Virginia, was walking through the section of the cemetery reserved for infant graves. There, he discovered the body of an elderly woman. Beside her stood a small, hand-decorated Christmas tree. She had a plastic bag over her head and headphones connected to a Walkman, which still held a cassette of an old Mel Brooks comedy routine. In her pockets were two envelopes. One held cash, neatly labeled. The other held typed notes signed only Jane Doe. She had no identification. She had no missing persons report on file. She would be known for the next 25 years only as the Christmas Tree Lady. The groundskeeper found her at Pleasant Valley Memorial Park, 8420 Little River Turnpike in Annandale, Virginia, in Fairfax County. She had been deceased only a short time. Beside her stood a small decorated Christmas tree about 8 inches tall, with gold baubles and red ribbon. She wore headphones connected to a Walkman that held a cassette of Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner's 2,000-year-old man comedy routine. How does an elderly woman take her own life in a public cemetery in a populated American suburb with handwritten notes and personal possessions, and stay unidentified for a quarter century? In her pockets were two envelopes. The first held two $50 bills with a note explaining that one was for the coroner and one was for the cemetery. The second held typed notes signed Jane Doe. One read, "Now I lay me down to sleep, soon to drift to the eternal deep. And though I die and shall not wake, sleep sweeter will be than this life I forsake." A separate note gave instructions for cremation. Toxicology found medication and brandy in her system. A flask was in her backpack. Cause of death was suffocation. The manner was suicide. The Northern District Medical Examiner's Office labeled the case N 1996-4-1257. Fairfax County Police took the case. Namis received it as UP 6279. She had no identification on her. She was not in any missing persons database in the National Capital Region. She had no family in the immediate area. Detective Richard Perez told the Washington Post in 2000, "What makes it so frustrating is that this isn't a case where we're dealing with skeletal remains. This is a lady that somebody should recognize." A colorized sketch released by Fairfax County Police in 2000 produced no leads. The case ran out of conventional avenues. The Christmas Tree Lady became a fixture of r/unresolved mysteries, web sleuths, the Doe Network, and true crime blogs. The atmosphere of the scene, the grave area location, the Christmas tree, the comedy tape, the meticulous suicide notes with cash for the coroner, made her one of the most haunting and frequently relitigated unidentified decedent cases on the English-speaking internet. She generated thousands of comments and theories over more than 2 decades. No single Reddit user is publicly credited with the eventual identification. But the long online discussion and the existence of the crowd-funded forensic genealogy infrastructure that grew out of that community is what made the eventual identification financially possible. In January 2022, the Fairfax County Police Department Cold Case Squad sent physical evidence to Othram Incorporated, a Houston-based forensic genealogy laboratory. Othram scientists used forensic-grade genome sequencing to develop a comprehensive genealogical profile. Forensic genetic genealogist Carla Davis executed the genealogical search. The sequencing and genealogy work were funded entirely by anonymous donors through the DNA Solves crowdfunding platform. The same kind of community-funded infrastructure first proven viable by the Lyle Stevick case 4 years earlier. In May 2022, investigative leads pointed to a single suspected family member. That connection led to additional family across the country. A DNA sample from a close relative confirmed the match. The match was confirmed on May 11, 2022, and announced publicly on July 7, 2022 by Fairfax County Police Major Ed O'Carroll. The Christmas tree lady was Joyce Marilyn Myers Summers, 69 years old at the time of her death, originally from Davenport, Iowa. The family believed she had moved to Virginia after the mid-1980s. She was not reported missing because she had no family in the area. Major O'Carroll said, after decades of wondering what happened to their loved one, Joyce's family is finally at peace thanks to the dedicated work of several generations of FCPD detectives, anonymous donors, and Othram. The reasons Joyce traveled to a Fairfax County Children's Section cemetery on December 18, 1996. Why that specific date, and what precipitated her departure from her earlier life, remain unanswered. The death itself remains closed as suicide. There is no criminal investigation. The case is now one of the most cited successes of DNA Solves crowdfunding and is regularly invoked in Fairfax County's continuing campaign to clear other long-dormant cold cases. The community of online sleuths who spent decades discussing the Christmas tree lady never met Joyce in life. They never knew her name, but they kept her file in front of the public for 25 years. They kept it on the radar of the people who eventually built the technology and the funding model to identify her. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.